One of the biggest exchanges between President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden last night was over health care. Biden says Trump wants to remove the Affordable Care Act and coverage for pre-existing conditions. You asked us to look into this, and we've had our Verify team investigating. Here's Jason Puckett.
Let's start with the claim from former Vice President Joe Biden Tuesday night on the Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare.
The president's made it clear he wants to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. He's been running on that, he ran on that, and he's been governing on that. He's in the Supreme Court right now trying to get rid of the Affordable Care Act.
First question, is President Trump trying to remove the Affordable Care Act through the Supreme Court? Yes. In June, the U.S. Solicitor General Noel Francisco sent this 82-page brief to the Supreme Court. It argues that the Supreme Court should declare the ACA unconstitutional. And right now, the Supreme Court is set to hear this case starting November 10th. President Trump backed this up Tuesday night.
Problem is, no matter how well you run Obamacare, it's a disaster. It's too expensive, premiums are too high, and it doesn't work. So we do want to get rid of it. Chris, we want to get rid of it.
I understand it, sir, but I have to give you.
So claim that President Trump wants to remove the Affordable Care Act, verified. Biden then claims removing the ACA would
strip 20 million people from having insurance, health insurance now, and there's 100 million people who have pre-existing conditions, and they'll be taken away as well.
So would removing the ACA also cause 20 million people to lose health insurance and nearly 100 million people to lose coverage for pre-existing conditions? Data from the Kaiser Family Foundation and the Urban Center show that roughly 20 million people would lose their insurance if the ACA were removed. And as of now, the only law guaranteeing coverage for people with pre-existing conditions is the Affordable Care Act. So right now, the claims that removing the ACA would cause 20 million people to lose their insurance and another 100 million plus to lose coverage for pre-existing conditions are verified. However, both of these groups of people could keep their coverage if the president and Congress pass new legislation before the ACA is removed. So far, President Trump has signed an executive order saying he's committed to protecting coverage for pre-existing conditions, but no laws have been passed that guarantee it. With your Verify, I'm Jason Puckett.